We're at noon. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Lubert. I am the Director of Career and Business Engagement with the Alumni Association. Welcome to today's conversation, Navigating Your Identity in the Workplace with a focus on disability in the workplace. I am very pleased to be here with all of you today, and we have a wonderful panel lined up for you. And as you can see, we're using, we're currently using meeting instead of webinar mode, just so we can enable more conversation flowing between the panelists and yourselves when it comes to the Q&A portion. And so I'll begin with a few introductory slides, and then we'll move into our panel today. And then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And then we'll have another portion where we have discussion with the audience members as well. So you're welcome to leave on your videos if you like, but we do ask if you can kindly press the mute button on your screen so that there isn't any interference with today's conversation. All right. So here we go. Make sure I click. All right. So as always, our Alumni webinar series is powered by our members and donors of the Alumni Association, and we truly appreciate their membership and everything they do for us. To learn more about our membership, you may go to umnalumni.org/membership. And today's webinar today, or conversation, is presented by our Maroon and Gold Network. The Maroon and Gold Network is a free online networking platform for students and alumni. Please join us on that website. I will send the information after today's conversation. It's a great platform to really initiate informational interviews, set up meetings, and just to get to know one another and network, essentially. Today's presentation is also brought to you by the Minnesota Alumni Market. The Minnesota Alumni Market is a great place to shop for goods and products that are specifically made by alumni. So definitely check that out when it comes to shopping for the holidays or any upcoming events you may have. And that's the Minnesota Alumni Market, which I'll also send a link for as well. Right. And then if you're interested in today's topic, you might be interested in some other upcoming webinars of interest. We have an Ask a Recruiter interviewing topic coming up on November 12th, the Coffee and Career Connections Industry event. And that event is both a panel and networking portion where we'll break up into breakout rooms for the individual conversations for that Coffee and Career Connections event. And then we also have Becoming an Entrepreneur, which will be held in a webinar format with a panel of entrepreneurs, and then we'll have Q&A from audience members. And I can definitely send this information out afterwards as well. But to find this information, you may also go to umnalumni.org/virtual. All right. And if you're tuning in by Zoom today, you also have another option to listen in by phone. You may dial 646-558-8658. And then when you're prompted, you can enter the webinar ID, which is 984-5857-8805. And at any time, if you have any questions, you may enter them into the Q&A box or the chat feature here that we have at any point that you like, but we will try to reserve many of your questions for the Q&A portion. All right, so without further ado, I'll begin introducing our panelists, starting with Peter Barwoltus. Peter Barwoltus is an alum of the University of Minnesota, graduated with a master's in public policy and a certificate of disability and policy services. Peter started the Humphrey Association for Disability and Mental Illness and became a student trainer at the University of Minnesota Disability Resource Center. While in graduate school, Peter was introduced to ARC and was an intern with the ARC of Minnesota and the ARC of Greater Twin Cities, and then served on their board from 2015 to 2017. After graduate school in 2015, Peter worked with the City of Minneapolis at the Department of Civil Rights before moving onto the Minnesota Department of Human Services. That same year to work for the Healthcare Eligibility and Access Division. At the Healthcare Eligibility and Access Division, Peter worked on the state's Medicaid programs and policy related to disability. In May 2019, Peter moved on to the Disability Services Division, where Peter is currently a fiscal analysis for the state's disability waiver programs, and has been, up until May of this year, the co-chair for the Employees with Disabilities Employee Resource Group at DHS, and is currently an active member. Thank you and welcome, Peter. Right. Next, we have Peter Joseph Campion. Peter is currently a doctoral student candidate at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy and Development, and has a Master's of Science degree in Human Development Education from North Dakota State University. Peter has more than a decade of collegiate teaching experience. Peter's work centers on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and has been charged with creating a lasting ripple effect to build hope, strength, and confidence among marginalized and underrepresented people in higher education. Peter is driven to be an expert for the topics of employee engagement, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral energy, disabilities, both apparent and non-apparent, exercise science, and the development of faculty members who are serving in academia. Peter will soon defend his dissertation titled The Engagement of Faculty Members with Disability in Higher Education. Along with Peter's current practitioner work, Peter has worked 3 years at the University of Minnesota's Extension Center for Community Vitality. Peter is also a guest lecturer for graduate courses about strategies for teaching adults with disabilities, as well as consulting with the Disability Resource Office, U-Return, about programming to assist faculty members with disabilities. Peter has also consulted with the University of Minnesota's graduate school regarding accessibility for a series of online orientation modules which were designed for new graduate students. Thank you and welcome, Peter. All right. Next, we have Chris. Chris Luhmann graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology and a Master's of Arts degree in higher education from the University of Minnesota. He has held a number of different positions in higher education at both the University of Minnesota and Normandale Community College. For the past 3 years, he has worked as an access consultant at the Disability Resource Center. He loves working with students and engaging in diversity, equity, inclusion work in higher education. Thank you and welcome, Chris. All right. So lots of great panelists here for you all today. The first question is just, we'll start with Peter, and then we'll go Chris, and then Peter. Peter Campion may start first. So tell us a little bit about yourself and the identities that you share.
Hi, everyone. I am Peter Campion. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am very grateful and honored to be here today with all of you and this great group of panelists, Chris and Peter. My intention today is to connect and be authentic about my journey as someone with disabilities, and for the most part, non-apparent disabilities. And I am excited and grateful. So thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Chris.
Hi, everybody. My name's Chris. I use he, him, his pronouns as well. In terms of identities, so I identify as a white cisgender male, also identify as gay, and have non-apparent disabilities that include depression and anxiety. I would say that my white male identity was not very difficult to navigate growing up, just because you know, I had a lot of privilege and wasn't really aware of my privilege at the time. On the other hand, growing up gay and with mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, it was a lot more difficult for me to understand and accept those things because they made me different. And you know, I felt ashamed of myself about those things. So I was dealing with a lot of internalized homophobia and ableism. However, during my time in college at the U, I became more open to learning about myself, my privileges, and the identities I have that make me different and unique. And I think it's been a challenging but also a a rewarding journey. And I'm still learning about myself and how those identities kind of play into systems of privilege and oppression in our society.
Thank you. And Peter, you may go next.
Hey everybody, my name is Peter Barwoltus. For me, there's not a lot of intersectionality with myself, so to say. I'm he, him, his as well, and I identify as somebody with a physical disability or an apparent disability, as I like to say, as opposed to non-apparent. And I have a wheelchair, and I've been in a wheelchair for over 10 years now, and that's kind of defined my journey with disability as to knowing a lot about and caring about physical disability on my career path. First, to being kind of self-centered with how can I help myself career-wise with eliminating physical barriers and whatnot, to when I got to grad school, knowing more about developmental disabilities and a whole other side of the disability spectrum or area. And then after that, when I got to DHS, I learned and came to know more about mental health, which I like to say is the final and third part of my disability journey and the work I do. So that's a little bit about myself.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing so openly. All right, our next question here is, how do you overcome, or how have you overcome ableism in the workplace?
Well, great question, Rebecca. Thank you for asking that. I have some pretty extreme bias around this because I'll be defending my dissertation within weeks, where I investigated faculty members with disabilities in the University of Minnesota system. So I just want to say that right away. So I've learned a lot of my my techniques of overcoming ableism through those connections over the years. And what I've learned is and this may lead into another slide and jump ahead, we'll go back and forth, but is the importance of community and the importance of, especially, I know Chris, actually, one of the other panelists, developed a community on the University of Minnesota campus that I'll let Chris speak to, but something of that nature where individuals who identify as having disabilities can connect with others, and they can share their experiences and share how they've overcame obstacles. Also, kind of understanding the landscape and being proactive, given the prevalence of ableism everywhere. And those have been the two biggest things for me, is so probably just being proactive and establishing community.
Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Peter around the piece around community. And as he was saying, me and a few colleagues developed, you can call it an employee resource group or an affinity group called Disabled Employees at the U, which basically, it's for any employee at the U who identifies as disabled and can be a part of this community to, understand resources or get support and advice from others about, maybe barriers they're experiencing in their own workplace. I'd say there's a couple other things in terms of overcoming ableism. I think one is talking about it. I think there might be sometimes stigma or, some shame around talking about these types of things. But I think talking about it with colleagues, managers, leadership about how ableism is showing up in your workplace. And, you know, I can understand that sometimes that can be difficult, especially if you feel like maybe you're the only person that is noticing these things, or, you know, but chances are, I think there's people also who are also noticing these things, or maybe experiencing ableism in their own way. And so I think, you know, if we stay silent about it, nothing's going to change. So really talking about it with colleagues or others. And I'd say the second part is then also, you know, moving from talking to also taking action and holding people accountable. Those are some of the main things I would I guess advocate for in terms of overcoming ableism in the workplace.
Thank you.
I know we just got a question on the definition of ableism. I don't know, Rebecca, do you want to handle that first, or tell everybody what ableism is, or?
Yeah.
Or I actually, this actually kind of goes off my answer too. I did a presentation on ableism and microaggressions. Let me see if I can find my answer here. So ableism is it's a societal or institutional practices that dominate attitudes that devalue and limit the potential of people with disabilities. So it's a set of assumptions and practices that promote differential or unequal treatment of people because of their actual or presumed disabilities. So that, like I said, I think that kind of goes off of, and I agree with both the panelists too, and I might not so much a different direction, but add on to what they said on overcoming ableism. Like I said, I just did a presentation on this at work, and I think one of the huge things is education and exposure. Sharing personal stories and meeting and knowing and learning from somebody with a disability can go a long way in changing environments and removing barriers and stigmas around people with disabilities. So one way to look at it, to kind of compare it to something would be the Black Lives Matter movement, is that you don't really know, if you don't know somebody, a person of color, or talk with them or learn from them, then you don't really know what is going on in their life and what they have to deal with on a daily basis. That's the same for people with disabilities in that regard. And I think that's kind of going off of what Chris said, is that, and to kind of answer the question of overcoming it, just letting people know and sharing with them and establishing relationships can go a long way. And so when I encounter it, a good attitude goes a long way, but talking with somebody and letting them know, like, hey, that wasn't like the right thing to say, but doing it in an okay way and educating them, and then establishing a relationship, I feel is a really good way to overcome ableism. And I've seen that in my current workplace as well. So.
Yes, and thank you for that definition. Yes, looking at some information online just to kind of bring some more definition to it. Discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. And I think that's both inadvertent and overt discrimination. So thinking about like the dominant identity here being those maybe who are able-bodied, who are designing processes or systems or events or programs or services, or just the way how things are operating in the office, and the language that's used that may favor the dominant identity. All right, so our next question here is, what is your experience with finding an employer that values access or / accommodations?
To kind of branch off the last question, overcoming ableism, just to touch on it, but I think Chris and Peter touched on advocacy in both of their roles, which has been very important with overcoming ableism as well, that I have seen from both of their work. But as far as my experience finding an employer that values access and accommodations, I have when I left my former career, I've been focused in higher ed because of the situations with my disability. And I have been pretty narrowly focused because I knew that folks in higher education specifically, and I know that this is true in federal government, that and state government to some extent, are mandated to be open to people with disabilities. But my experience is, and this is kind of a plug, like when I graduate in the next few weeks, I'm looking for work in higher ed. And my experiences have been very positive for the most part, but I haven't ventured out of higher ed in a very long time. And I've been at North Dakota State and at the University of Minnesota. And this is a testament to Chris and the office of which Chris serves, and the great work that they do, and the great work that Donna Johnson and Cynthia Fuller and Dave Fuker do at the University of Minnesota for assisting individuals with disabilities as a student and as an employee. So I know that I'm very fortunate and that I'm an outlier in this opinion. But I also think that I've known about the ableism and the resistance to accommodations away from spaces like University of Minnesota.
Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, kind of the same as Peter, I have mostly worked in higher ed. I mean, that's kind of my degree is higher ed. So, but I would say in general, higher ed in general is pretty inclusive and accessible. Although I still think there is a lot of work to be done. I think like sometimes me and my colleagues joke about, we want to work ourselves out of a job, meaning like we're there because the university is inaccessible and we're providing accommodations for whether it's students, staff, faculty, or guests, because the university is inaccessible. And so the accommodations is one piece, but we're also trying to do a lot of training and education, like Peter was talking about, to make sure that people are aware of these issues or barriers that are coming up, so that they can design programs and materials that are more accessible for everyone. I think, yeah, employers that value access and accommodations, for me personally, it makes me feel a lot more accepted and appreciated as a person, who has different strengths and talents to bring. That means I might not do everything the same way as my colleagues, but that doesn't mean I'm any less valuable as an employee. And I think when employers can notice that and appreciate that it really has the opportunity to bring on a diverse group of employers and, with different identities, experience, and perspectives that can add a lot to the organization.
Fortunately, I don't have a different answer because I too have worked for nonprofit with disabilities and government, where both of those, it's kind of already given, or that you will get accommodation, or that something is going to happen there. but I will speak to the value of it. We just because we have an ADA office at the state or provide accommodations doesn't mean it's always valued. And I think even some members I know from people that have messaged me that are listening today know that that's not true at the state, and the articles are there to prove it as well. So we are in a process of changing the culture around that. But I myself haven't had any personal stories on how to change that experience at the state, because I didn't need any too many, I should say, in the first place. And I never came into the job expecting that I was never going to get accommodations. But I will say this, I in interviews before, and this actually happened with this city too, is when you go into an interview or a job process, you should never, ever, regardless of the law, expect that accommodations is going to be given to you. And so when I come into a job process and I don't tell somebody that I'm in a wheelchair, I don't ask them and say, hey, what are you going to do for me in terms of accommodations? I always, what I come in and I do is I say, hey, here's what we can do together. Here's how I'll work with you to make sure this happens. So it's never a process like in the back of their heads, they're like, oh, somebody is going to need this, this, and this, and this, and they can't do the job. You should always come into it with an attitude that nothing's going to be given to you, and you should have to work with them together. That's just the realities of today, regardless of what the law is, even at this state. So
That seems unfortunate.
yeah.
And in some ways you want to know, like, what are some, prior practices of how they've demonstrated inclusivity and access, and maybe it's even asking some open-ended questions like that, or even looking at the organization's websites and looking for diversity and inclusion statements and seeing if there's any employee resource groups, perhaps as a starting point at kind of breaking ice to see, like, do they value equity and inclusion and what that looks like, even at the bare minimum. All right. Next question here is, how have you dealt with imposter syndrome and or self-doubt? And if so, have you dealt with imposter syndrome and or self-doubt? And if so, how have you overcome that? And so we've talked about this even amongst ourselves, like defining imposter syndrome. And so in some ways, imposter syndrome is never feeling like you're good enough, that you're measuring up to maybe another person or the culture around you, that maybe your work or who you are as a professional isn't as good as it should be, and that you may need to work harder. You feel like you may have to work harder to just measure up. So some of those feelings of doubting your abilities and doubting what you can bring to the table to an organization in some ways. And so I turn over this question to each of you.
Well, I deal with this every morning, and it's a fresh battle every morning, if not like every hour, to navigate the self-doubt and the imposter syndrome, whether I'm good enough to work in higher ed, or whether I'm good enough to be a faculty member working in higher education, or someone who serves in a disability resources office and does hybrid work of a faculty member and who works disability resources. And I, especially, and I know something popped up about the 30th anniversary of the ADA, and there was a webinar that came up. And one thing that I've really struggled with, and I've had to learn to reframe is the mitigating factors that I have to do each day in order to be successful. Does not mean that the disability is fake or like to everyone else, and that like what I do doesn't matter, if that makes any sense to the rest of the panelists. But and how I've overcame that is I have very strict routines as far as sleep and exercise, and everything's done on a timer. And I also, it goes back to the points from the other questions about community, advocacy, and using the resources that are available to understand that others are feeling the same imposter syndrome, and that and what they do each day and how their routines may be different, but that a lot of people are going through it, and that in that morning when you wake up, that you're not alone, and to know that you're not alone, and then to find people who've traveled the journey and have already accomplished what you want to accomplish, finding them and just keep trying until you create a group of mentors, and then you have a group of mentees, and then you kind of work that on both ways. And I think that sharing of that experience has helped me navigate and overcome the imposter syndrome.
Yeah, for me, I have also definitely dealt with imposter syndrome. And I think, again, I mentioned this earlier, I think there's still some internalized ableism that, I'm still working through, even though I've, been doing this work for a long time. I can just share that, like, a personal experience a few years ago while I was working at the Disability Resource Center on campus. I actually needed to take FMLA, so Family Medical Leave Absence, for mental health reasons. And this was my first time pursuing FMLA. So I was feeling scared, anxious, guilty, shameful, all of the things. And I kept thinking to myself, like, I'm not good enough to do my job. What will my colleagues and managers think of me? Is there something wrong with me? So there was a lot of self-doubt running in my mind. And I think even more so because it was for mental health reasons, I feel like if someone needed to take FMLA for cancer, I think our society is a little more understanding of that type of situation. And that's not to take away from, if a person who has cancer, like, they may also experience imposter syndrome and are dealing with their own difficulties. But I think there's just the stigma around mental health, and, whether that constitutes a real disability, and, if it's eligible for FMLA, those sorts of things. So that was one thing I definitely was navigating. It was a new experience for me. But looking back on it, again, I came to realize that it was more, I was viewing myself as the problem, that there was something wrong with me, rather than looking more at, like, the systems and structures in place that maybe made it difficult for me to work in that type of environment. And I think it just goes to show how kind of strong and widespread ableism is within our culture.
For me, imposter syndrome, I haven't experienced firsthand to my face. Self-doubt, yes, but I'll speak to imposter syndrome, especially at the state. We have a program called Connect 700, and it is a program that is supposed to help bring people with disabilities into the state hiring process by making it easier for them to get hired. The problem with that, and what I saw when I was the head of the employee resource group for people with disabilities, is you see the stigma behind somebody coming in on that program all the time, from supervisors and managers, because it was always, well, they come in through this program, so they only got the job because of that. And it was the exact opposite of what the program was designed to do. So how did we deal with that? We had to have buy-in from leadership, and what I mean from leadership is all the way up the top, from the commissioner on down, to make it known that, and to the employee resources group, credit too. We had to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and talking about these issues with leadership to kind of change the culture, not only of DHS, but of leadership in general, and how they viewed disability and the Connect 700 program. I would say, self-doubt wise for myself, I all the time I think about it in employment sometimes, especially when you get into a job, and how I've kind of handled that myself is always establishing a relationship with somebody. And that kind of brings me back to one of my previous answers of, if you just show somebody and kind of have a working relationship with them and show them that, hey, I'm like you, I might have a disability, but we think the same way. We have the same knowledge base, and not to kind of hermit myself or put myself in a corner when it comes to things, but just openly talking and working with people together. Because the easy answer would just be, well, just do my work and work hard, and then people will see. And I really think establishing relationships with people that don't have disabilities or don't know somebody that has a disability goes a long way in getting rid of self-doubt and doubt in others too that you work with. So
Yes, and thank you so much for that. And brings us to come to our next question. I think we touched on some of these resources already and information, but we'll touch on it again. What suggestions do you have for creating community and resources in and out of the workplace?
Well, I think Peter Beat has talked about creating those friendships. And that's one thing that I learned from my personal experience and from my research with faculty with disabilities. And I think having those affinity groups like disabled employees at the U, like Chris's group, and I think even connecting with other, if you work in, like, and I'm working in higher ed, so AHEAD, the Association in Higher Education and Disability, and there's a Minnesota chapter and a national chapter, and I don't know if there may be other type of fields that have those affinity groups away from higher ed, but creating those communities, and again, finding people who've done it for a while and have lived it for a while, and also those who are at your same place and those who are coming behind you, and just developing those relationships and community there. The resources, I think, developing yourself in the ways that you need to each day, or each morning and each afternoon, to be able to be your best, and again, having those people surround you that uplift you and give you the energy you need each day. That's my experience.
Yeah, as I talked about before, I think a big one for creating community is creating employee resource groups or affinity groups. So yeah, the disabled employees at the U, we started that a couple years ago, and I think it's been a great way to meet new people and also start to hear kind of shared experiences among people to provide just kind of that support, the support network, as well as just advice or suggestions on how to maybe deal with certain situations. I'm also thinking about other organizations or nonprofit organizations that are, I guess, outside the U, but focus on specific types of disabilities. So, for example, NAMI, which stands for National Alliance on Mental Illness. I know there's a national organization, but also they have chapters in different states. And so Minnesota has a chapter as well. And, they also provide resources and support groups. And I've volunteered and have been a part of NAMI and have found some great people through that type of organization as well. Specifically at the U, another resource that might be of interest to some people is the employee assistance program, which basically it's a part of our benefits as an employee working at the U, where you get so many free counseling / therapy sessions with a professional. And, that could be for mental health reasons or other disability related reasons or concerns that you're working through at the workplace. So that's another good resource. And I'd also say, like, if you are a person with a disability, connecting with HR to make sure that you are getting the accommodations you need for work. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I won't. Peter and Chris are spot on. Because my answer, of course, is employee resource groups is just taking off, and that's not just for the state itself. I know for a fact that Target and Nordstrom both have employee resource groups as well. Our commissioner championed them early on at Medtronic, and I think it's a double-edged sword in terms of resources and community, because our employee resource group at DHS actually created resources for people to go out and reach to. But I would say too, we did a survey as well of all of our members, and expanded over time, where we got up to, we were 10 members and we got up to somewhere around 60 to 100. And we had 16 people say in the survey that they stayed working at DHS because of our employee resource group. I mean, I was surprised if we would have just got one person, but it's such a huge thing. And I would say if your organization or company doesn't have one, I think somebody might have mentioned this in the chat too, there are resource groups online from LinkedIn to wherever, where you can find your disability, regardless of what it is, and find a community out there. That doesn't necessarily have to be within your company itself, but like, this is just off the top of my head, I don't even know if this is real, but Disabled Farmers Group is, out there. They're not all in the same company, but they all have the same disability and they all have the same job. And I think there's a lot out there in regards to that. And not only based on job too, just based off, I have a disability in, this region of the country. There are groups like that as well too. And a lot of those groups not only, like I said, provide community, but also provide resources for you too. So.
Great, thank you so much. That was a lot of great information, just thinking about how to find and locate communities of interest and those where you can connect with others and have shared identities and experiences that you can speak to. I forgot my other point. I was going to say one more thing, but we'll move on to the next portion of this. And now it's time for questions from our audience members. So let's see, if you have any questions, you're welcome to either write them in the chat or turn your video on if you're brave and ask your question. I don't know how we're going to manage it. It's my first time managing this kind of combo, so let's see how it goes.
It looks like there is some questions in the chat.
Okay, yeah.
Potentially. So I'm reading one from Nicole. Does have any of the panelists been forced out of a job or fired because of your disability?
I can speak to that one actually. I haven't, but in the hiring practice, I know for a fact that I was almost not hired because of my disability. And I think that was something very hard to know after the fact, but I actually changed and shifted my employer's entire position around disability in general and what I could do for the job or what I did in the job itself. And that goes back to what I said about establishing relationships, not only with those that you work with, but your employer itself too. But no, I can't speak to getting fired or let go because of disability.
I've self-selected to leave. I don't know. I didn't feel forced out, but I felt before I disclosed, I saw cultures that towards people who had disclosed and that I didn't agree with, and that were things that I didn't want to experience myself. And I've left places because of that, but I haven't been forced out, so to speak.
Yeah, I haven't personally experienced being forced out or fired, but I do know people, even some friends who have had that experience, which is unfortunate.
I'll go off what both of you said too. I have seen at this state as well, members of our own ERG have been forced to leave because accommodations were not met for them. And that's a very troubling thing to see. And I think it's all about a culture change, not only for supervisors and managers and providing education and sharing personal stories. Those are all things that we need to work on together in order to make sure that doesn't happen in the future too, but also our ADA office too needs more resources, and we've been pushing and pushing and pushing that to make that change as well, so people get accommodations in a timely manner.
Looks like we have another question here in the chat. Probably have time for maybe a few minutes. When applying for a job with a taxed, maybe I pronounced that wrong, disability, do you list your disability on the job application, or do you opt out of answering that question?
I'll give the perspectives from somebody with an apparent disability. Unless it says on the application, no. Otherwise, but sometimes it depends on the field. Like if I feel they need to know, like in case I need to get in the building in a certain way, then I'll email them ahead of time. Otherwise, no, it shouldn't be important. But also, this goes back to a point I was trying to make before about when you come into that, you should always try, regardless of what the disability is, always let them know that you're going to be willing to make the accommodations, arrangements with them to do this together. And I will say, unless you're this kind of goes back to what I was saying before too. If your interview requires you to make accommodations, so deaf, hard of hearing, anything like that, or where you're going to need interpreters or something, then I would definitely let them know ahead of time too.
So I have someone here, Mary Leon from Disability In. She's actually from Texas, the North Texas group, and there's also a Minnesota group as well. It's quite active, and they're having a job fair coming up called Disability In Minnesota Inclusive Career Fair. But Mary would like to answer the question as well.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca. This is Mary Leone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'd like to share a little bit about Disability In, the national organization, and then they also have local affiliates, one being in Minneapolis. I just happen to be the vice chair for the affiliate in North Texas, which is in Dallas. And what we do is we do outreach, and we help businesses with their best practices and building and growing programs that employ people with disabilities. Now, there is also a vendor component, so we encourage disability-owned business enterprises. And there is at the national level, which they have a national conference. At the national level, they also have an internship program, mentorship, as well as disability next gen. So these are up and comers, so people in college. So think people from University of Minnesota, they can actually apply, and it's a special program that they can go through, and they, I want to say they get a lot of attention, but there have been some pretty incredible experiences and people coming out of that program as a result of their participation. So I also wanted to answer the question from a compliance standpoint in terms of disclosing your disability in the interview process. I've been a talent acquisition leader for many more years than I care to admit. I've also been an HR compliance professional when the OFCCP put out some new regulations in terms of requiring government contractors and subcontractors to ask people about to self-disclose their disability status. Now, you can choose to disclose it or not to disclose it, and they have the different choices, but no, you are going to be asked that both as an applicant as part of the process, as well as an employee. And you're going to be asked that as part of being an employee at least every 5 years. That information is supposed to be kept confidential. So me as a recruiting person, I would not be able to see that unless you choose to disclose it. So I have a hearing impairment, and if that would be something that I would want to disclose because I would need a special accommodation, then I could choose to disclose that at any time during the process, but that should be completely separate from me checking a box if I choose to, saying that I have a disability. So hopefully that was helpful, and I know that was very compliance driven, but I wanted people to know that if you do disclose that you choose to self-identify you have a disability, that is supposed to be kept confidential, and it's not supposed to be shared with your interview team unless you choose to share it as part of an accommodation process.
Thank you so much, Mary Leone, for that information and for jumping on and being with us today. Thank you. And looks like now we can either answer another audience question, or we can move on to the next question about having audience members share their own community resources and other ways that they create community and connect with others. So if you have any of those resources, you're welcome to write them into the chat box, or you can turn on your video. We can try to figure it out.
I'll just answer the question about the future of Connect 700 program real quick. Actually, I don't know if I can answer it. I don't know. I don't know what the fix there is, but I would say on the standpoint of changing the narrative around the program and who gets hired in is going to be a long-term process, as much as the process is of changing the narrative around people with disabilities and hiring them. So there's no easy fix to it, unfortunately. I think one, at least at the state level, is fixing the ADA. I wouldn't say fixing, I would say just expanding on the ADA office in general and providing them with more resources so that, you know, the stigma doesn't start right away. Because if somebody with a disability doesn't have any accommodations to do their job, then it's going to be like, well, this person can't do the job because of their disability. So I think making sure that we have the resources and give the ADA office everything they need and request to make sure that this that stigma goes away is a huge part of it. But as a total fix to the program, that's beyond my pay grade or no. So.
It looks like there, well, we can probably get to another question chat here. How do you think the pandemic will change disability accommodations in the workplace? I'm curious to know what you think, and maybe if Mary wants to offer information on that too, that may be interesting.
Hi, Rebecca. This is Mary again. We've had a couple of presentations on this. We actually had one for disability in North Texas in September with Julie Sowash, if anybody has heard of her. She's an executive director of a disability group that actually helped Pepsi win the ODEP award this year. So again, she does really, really good work. But she actually talked about how with so many people working from home and experiencing some not so pleasant circumstances all the time, and experiencing some needs for accommodations, and how people without disabilities are now thinking and experiencing the same thing that people with disabilities have been living with for years and years and years. And so maybe there is a better appreciation for needing an accommodation in the workplace. So hopefully this will bring to light more of those accommodations and the importance of that. Because again, if people are working from home for 12 months, for 18 months, and they just don't have a good setup for their home office, and they need accommodations, or they need it differently than they would in the office, it'll bring different things to light. So I would expect that more people are going to be needing accommodations, especially as it relates to mental illness and other things, with either being so remote or just experiencing so much stress and anxiety due to the pandemic. I'd be interested to hear what some of the other panelists think.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think also it can definitely exacerbate mental health, or not just mental health, but disability impacts in general for some people. So, you know, I think about somebody who has a TBI and is working from home now and is needing to do, you know, be on the computer all day, every day. And where in our normal, quote unquote, normal environment, you know, we would have those breaks in between being on the computer when we're meeting with others. And so obviously those symptoms can definitely, or those disability impacts can be more significant. Same with mental health. You know, personally, it definitely takes a toll on a person when all we're doing is being online and not having that human to human interaction. So I think, yeah, there's definitely, we have been trying to explore other accommodations. I mean, personally, I work on the student side, meaning I just do student accommodations. I don't do necessarily employee accommodations, but we have noticed, you know, certain disability impacts being more impacted, and having to explore other accommodations for that.
I agree with Mary and Chris, especially given our earlier parts of the discussion about community, and with the TBI issue, because I identify as someone with TBI issues. But the hard part, I think, with the pandemic is maintaining the community, right? And the Zoom fatigue, and you know, for those that are huggers like I am, like giving somebody a hug that you haven't seen in a week, or a good friend, and you know, that part of someone's routine, when it's been taken away to keep us safe because of COVID-19 is really hard. And I think that disability in general is and around the frame of mental health, like Chris talked about, is really having to address those issues. I couldn't agree more with Mary and Chris and Peter B.
Thank you so much. And that looks like all the time we have. Peter B, did you want to add anything else?
Just real quick, I would say just from the employee resource group, we've had it both ways. I would just say that it's going to change no matter what. Like working from home is going to change the disability community. Some people love it, some people hate it. We've just seen it both ways. So it's going to be very interesting to see where it goes in the future, but I don't think there's any doubt that it's going to change going forward.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. This concludes our Navigating Your Identity in the Workplace, Disability in the Workplace. This is our first, actually, of this series. We'll have Disability in the Workplace, LGBTQ in the Workplace, and we'll host that one in December. So if that's also another identity that you share, you may tune into that one as well. And I'll share the information later when I share out the recording of today's session. And so thank you so much to Peter Campion, Chris Luhmann, and Peter Barwoltus, and Mary Leone for jumping on here. Thank you so much, everyone. This was a great conversation. If you have any other resources or information you'd like to share with me, you may email me at luebbert@umn.edu. And then, yeah, feel free to share information with me, and I'll be sending out the recording and then a feedback form as well for you to provide feedback on today's experience and let us know how we can improve this experience for you moving forward and what other conversations you'd like to see us host. All right, thank you so much and have a great day. Bye, everyone.